We are live.
We're live. Hello, and welcome to the this month's November's Kid Club meeting for Last of the Sandwalkers, which is an awesome book. And we've got Jay Hosler here, who's right there. Hi, Jay. How are you?
Hello. I'm delighted to be in San Francisco, even if it's just virtually.
Yeah. And I love that he's got a spinner rack in the back of his office. That's the coolest thing. And it looks like there are bug-themed comics on there. I see the Fly at least.
Yeah, we got the Fly. I have not bug theme, but usually science theme. So I have Steve Bissett's Tyrant.
Oh, very good.
Terrific.
We got dinosaurs.
Really?
Right. About a T-Rex, actually. Its life cycle. He does a really nice job.
Very good. Yeah. So you guys like the book? Yeah?
Yeah.
Super good. Do you guys have any questions or stuff you guys want to say to start with? Guys?
What gave you the idea for Owen in general?
That is a great question. So the book is sort of about, well, obviously you've read the book, so you know it's Lucy, right? She's the central character. She leaves her island oasis and discovers the world's a little more complicated than she was initially led to believe. And she, in some ways, is sort of a stand-in for Darwin, who made a similar journey along, for 5 years across the ocean. And it turns out Darwin had sort of a scientific enemy. And that scientific enemy was actually a great anatomist named Richard Owen. But Owen did some shady stuff. And so I decided to make Owen my villain.
That's my fault.
So Owen comes from Sir Richard Owen, and who was sort of a scheming individual when it came to making sure that his theories were first and foremost in the scientific press. And he did little things to sort of undermine Darwin and other scientists at the time. And so he became sort of this perfect foil, I thought, for Lucy. So Owen is based essentially on him. Now, the beetle that he's based upon is a South American beetle. And that beetle's sort of interesting at the time. So let's see if I can pull this description off. At the time, Sir Richard Owen's sort of view of the world was shrinking, right? He was sort of losing power in terms of his types of theories. He didn't like the idea of evolution, for example. And likewise, this little beetle that he was based upon lives in South Africa, and it lives in the mountains, but it prefers cold temperatures. And with sort of the change in global climate, it's getting warmer and warmer. And so these beetles are sort of being pushed to the top of this mountain. They're running out of a place to live. Their world is sort of shrinking. And I thought that was a great metaphor for Owen as well. And so those are the two things that sort of came together.
Yeah, he was a very impressively evil bad guy, I thought.
Yeah.
That was one of the scariest, meanest bad guys I've read in a comic in a while.
And the truth is that it's really sort of the first villain that I've written. I don't tend to do villains, especially when you're doing sort of nature comics. I try to steer away from turning anything in nature into a villain, right? Because everything's got its part, it plays its role. I mean, we hate mosquitoes, but they're just trying to get blood for their babies. I mean, it's hard to fault an animal for trying to get food for their offspring. But this book in particular, this style demanded a villain, and actually I can thank my son Max, who actually helped me pull back a little bit from too much of the hand-wringing blah ha ha villain. Because he pointed out to me once, he's like, it's interesting. Owen thinks he's the good guy. And I thought, wow, you know what? And he sort of told me that halfway through as I was writing. And affected the way I wrote Owen. And while he's still the bad guy, it also made me a little more sympathetic, which I think makes him a more interesting villain, you know, that he thinks he's saving people. And from the outside, we look at it and go, wow, he's nasty. I hate him. But, you know, it makes for a more compelling villain, I think, when they think they're the good guy.
Well, we're all the heroes of our own stories.
That's right. Our own mythologies, absolutely. I've got super strength and super speed, so just FYI.
Demonstrate. Do you have a question?
So what inspired you to do this like style of art? Is it just the type that you draw normally, or is it?
Oh, that is another super question. So I started this book 10 years ago. Well, 12 years ago. I guess it's 11 years ago now. I'm trying to do the math. Yeah, 11 years ago. And when I did it, so just to give you a little background, my first book was a book about bees called Clanapus, and then the second book I did was called The Sandwalk Adventures, and that was about Charles Darwin, completely different sandwalk as opposed to this title. And it was interesting because I did Clanapus in about a year, and I had no babies. And I did Sandwalk Adventures in 3 years with 1 baby. And I was starting to think, man, and we had just had our second child, Jack, and I'm thinking, whew, it's going to take me forever to get the next book done, which it turned out it did. But so I thought to myself, you know, I'm going to draw this next book in a really simple style, really super simple. I am going to try to share something on my screen now to show you what that initial style was. Okay, so I'm going to go to this. Let's see. Oh wait, I got to do something first. Be patient with me. I'm old. Let's see. I can sing while we're waiting. Oh, no, I was right in the right place. See, I talk to myself all the time. It's a bad habit. Okay, now this is going to work for surezies. Okay, I'm going to go to share screen. Then I'm going to share this. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know if my cursor is working, but I'm circling the one on the left, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, you can see that's really, really hyper simplified, right? The insects are essentially little, like, I don't know, mini sausages that you get at a fancy party. And they've got simple legs, no articulation, little funny cartoony antenna. This is Lucy. Here's Rafe. Here's Professor Bombadier's head. This is Mossy, right? And I wrote and drew probably, 10 pages of the story in this style. And the other thing is that I normally draw 10 inches by 15 inches, so it's a big sheet of paper. And on this, I drew it half that size. So I was drawing it smaller, I was drawing it more simply, and I was putting fewer panels on the page. And you'll even notice that I didn't use a ruler to do the edges of the panels. I started doing this book, and my primary thought was doing it simply and quickly. And after about 10 or 15 pages, I can't remember how many I did, I realized that I hated it. And there were a couple reasons why. The first is, this is Lucy, this is Mossy, and I could not tell the difference. And I was pretty sure if I couldn't tell the difference, nobody else could. And the other thing was that, you know, my interests are in telling stories about nature, which is sort of the thing I know, right? It's in my wheelhouse. And what I had done with this very simple style had extracted all of the wonder and the beauty that was interesting for me to draw. And so I thought, you know, if I'm going to do it, if the story is important to me, then it has to contain that beauty, that wonder, that is what's so compelling for me. And so, you know, I put those pages aside, I started over again, and I did so in this style. And you know what I'm trying to show when I draw this way. Well, number one, let me say this: drawing it this way, the more complicated way, more detailed way, is way more satisfying for me as a cartoonist. So a big part of this was my pleasure, right? If you're going to commit a lot of time to doing something, you got to love doing it. And you can't, and I think that getting something done quickly, which was my motivation, was a pretty bad motivation. And not a very good one. So I drew it this way. The other thing is that, you know, if you ever lay on the ground, and you can do this in San Francisco in the winter, we can't really do this in San Francisco or in Pennsylvania in the winter, but you can lay on the ground and look at weeds, and you know what? They are really interesting. They're beautiful, actually. And so what I wanted to show in this story visually was this wonder of this little world. I sometimes talk about insects as aliens underfoot, right? They are totally weird compared to us. We have an internal skeleton, they have an external skeleton. We have 4 legs, they have 6. We have a nose, they have antenna. We have a camera eye, they have a compound eye. They are really, really different from us. And so when you get down into their world, a world that we don't really exist in, it's really sort of alien and almost magical in its reality, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so that is what I wanted to do, and that is why I took that approach. And the last reason is that it sort of captures the types of cartooning that I loved as a kid. And so I loved artists like Hergé, right, with Tintin, because what I would do is I would sit and just stare at a page. You know, I would allow my eye to sort of wander through this page, and there were all these surprises visually, these little things that Hergé would stick in places, and not necessarily hiding them, but just the details. A lamp here that he drew with love, you know, and those are the things that sort of occupied my time as I was reading comics visually. And so in no small way, I was also writing this for the little middle schooler that lives inside of me.
Mm-hmm.
Did that answer your question?
We got a question from the internet from Shadowcake. How did you get the idea to make this book about beetles?
Ah, okay. I'm going to show you something else. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. This is exciting technology. Okay, so I'm going to go to share. I'm going to go to this. Now, if I change the slide, can you see it? If it change, do you see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So out here on the East Coast, there's a conference called, well, a convention called the Small Press Expo. It takes place in Bethesda, Maryland. And it's a lot of independent, self-published, small press cartoonists that get together, and I think it's the only show I've been to in the last 10 years. I really love going there. When I was, it was 2003, I think, and I had my oldest son, who at that time was 4, sitting on my lap at my table, and desperately trying to entertain him, as my wife Lisa had Jack, who was just newly born, about 18 months. She was up in the room with him. And so, so I started drawing this picture, and it really sort of was, I was sort of using a style for the bug here that you saw in that later drawing that I showed you of Lucy, the really simplified ones. But what inspired this drawing was there is a cartoonist named Xander Cannon who does a book called Kaiju. At the time, he was doing a book called The Replacement God, and he had some bug characters in his book that I thought were absolutely adorable. So those bug characters were the inspiration for this particular group of very simplified bugs. And they weren't intended to be beetles or anything, but I was really just drawing bugs, doing simple things on a big sheet of paper to try to keep Max entertained. So I could make him. I was drawing these, and he was giggling like crazy, and I thought, wow, well, this might be the next book, and in fact, it turned out to be. You can see that he liked it because he signed his name Max right in the middle. And he did that when I looked away. So I was sitting there with him on my lap, and I had the picture right there and working, and somebody came to my table, and they bought a book, and I think I signed a couple, and then I turned back, and he's got his marker, and he has written his name right in the center. And you can see each place that he stopped because there's a little dot. It's almost like his name is connect the dots because he was just learning how to write. So I figured if it was good enough for him to sign and try to steal from me, it was good enough to make into a book.
So do you? So the first book was Ants. And Sandwalk Adventures was, as I believe it was mites, right? Mites that were living in.
Yeah, volatile mites. Yep.
And beetles. So what's the next bug that we've got?
So we're gonna do leafcutter ants.
Ooh, cool.
And the story there, I'm gonna show you another picture. I'm completely getting used to this now. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so this is a story that has been percolating in the back of my mind for a long time, and in fact has existed there in different bits and pieces, sort of, in fact, probably 2 or 3 different stories. But in, let's see, last semester in the spring, I was on sabbatical, and sabbatical is a fancy way for academics to talk about having a vacation to think. And so I had this vacation to think, when I could think and write and do a whole bunch of stuff. And you know, thinking for me takes a lot of effort. And so I had to sit quietly for several days. But when I did, several different story ideas sort of came together and linked up. And the basic idea is this. When I did my first book, Clan Apis, which was about honeybees, I wanted it to look like the bees were, that if you took away the words, it would look like bees interacting. But the bees still talked. And so as a challenge, I was wondering, could I plunk a cartoon animal into a real hive or real colony of social insects where they don't talk? It's just that one little ant. And so that ant you see there, that little blue ant, her name is Kushi. And she is the product of the only magical event that has ever occurred in the entire universe. And that is a cartoon ant born into a colony of leafcutters. And she's surrounded by these ants that accept her, right, into the colony, but can't really understand her. She's a different color. She loves to tell stories. She talks. You know, she talks with her mouth. The ants communicate with smells. So it's a little bit about being the odd person out, which, you know, I have felt at various times in my life. The town I grew up in Indiana, I think I was the only person who read comics. So I'm jealous that you guys have a comics club, you know, a graphic novel book club, because I think I would have just about done anything to talk about comics with anybody when I was growing up. And so Kushi has all these stories she wants to tell, but, you know, and she tries to tell them to her sisters, but it doesn't quite work. And then one day she meets another ant that can talk, and they become friends, but her friend sort of has a secret. And I can't tell you what that is because it would kind of blow the story, but the story's sort of about being different and why that's great sometimes, and why sometimes it's tough. But it's also about the being part of a group, even when you are different. And so that's going to be the next big project. We're gonna look at leafcutter ants, which are pretty amazing ants. They can dig a gigantic colony underground with their mouths. They can move tons of dirt, and they go to plants, cut off parts of their leaves, bury them underground, grow fungus on the leaves, use the fungus to feed their babies. I mean, they're farmers, and they've got farms essentially in this fortress that they live in. So it's pretty cool, or at least I think it's pretty cool. I'm going to try to convince readers that it's pretty cool as well.
I saw that piece of art is in color.
Yes.
This is going to be your first color book, then?
This would be. So I've had a couple experiences at conventions where kids have come up to the table and they don't know anything about the book, so they look through them. And I even had one kid who was interested in insects, and he did not buy the book because it wasn't in color. And I've recently gotten an agent, so I've been working for 15 years without an agent, and she's also pushing for color as well, which I've really never been against. I just didn't know how to go about it. And so I'm slowly teaching myself how to color, but I think I'm going to hire a colorist to actually do the book. I just wanted to color a little bit of it. It's interesting in terms of process. I ink things differently if I know it's going to be in color versus black and white. So for me, I tend to do a lot of heavy darks, heavy blacks if I know it's going to be black and white, but I have to actually leave more open space for the color. And for the colorist, I think to use color to model an image and whatnot. And so I've been coloring it myself just to get a sense of whether or not I'm sort of doing it correctly for the colorist. But yes, this will be the first color one. And I think that if I could go back and color all my other ones, I'm going to see if I can do that as well.
Nice.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
It's so sweet.
And for instance, the abolition one.
Right. You know what? That's a really good question. With Hill and Wang, now that was a chance to work with Xander Cannon and Kevin Cannon. That would be a great book to be in color. And you know what would be great about it is that evolutionarily, color has been so important for animals. You know, birds and insects in terms of hiding and in terms of finding a mate, right? Fancy feathers. These are all really things that we couldn't show too well in black and white. We'd have to see if we could twist Xander and Kevin's arms to go back and color it, or maybe we could just get a colorist who's somebody else. But that would be a fun one to color, I think.
Yeah.
So the rest of you guys have any questions or thoughts or comments? Come on. CJ, you got something to say. You always have something to say.
I don't know. I don't really have much to say.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Is Lucy's species really called the sandwalker? A sandwalker?
No, you know what? That's an interesting question. So they're not. That Lucy's species doesn't really have. Well, she does have sort of a simple name. Her scientific name is Stentara dentata, but she's known as a fog collecting beetle. So in Namibia, that's what they call them, fog collectors. And on the edge of a dune in the morning, you will see fog rolling in over the desert, and that fog collects on the back. And so you can look at the edge of that dune, and there's a whole bunch of beetles just like Lucy, standing on their heads as the fog kind of rolls in. I guess you guys have lots of fog in San Francisco, don't you?
Yeah.
So imagine a bunch of beetles hanging out on the Golden Gate Bridge, getting a drink of water. Right? That's what's going on. And so so she's known as a fog collector. And they actually are. You know, in the book, I have her, you know, she had a little invention, right, where she spread essentially some tarps just like her bumpy back, and they were collecting water in little troughs. And there are actually scientists that are working now to do the same thing, to use sort of, well, they call it biomimicry. That's where you see something an animal does, and you try to build a device that does the same thing. And so you've got researchers who are trying to use this technique to collect water for regions of the world in which water is in demand, especially in desert communities. So
So the thing I might
I saw
ask
you raise your hand, CJ.
I now have something to say, actually.
Excellent.
So, I was actually, I was reading the very beginning part of it, and they talked about the coconut thing, how it felt, and then when they went to the desert, I was like, is this like a real desert somewhere, or is this like a beach? Because there's coconuts are usually on trees that are by the beach, so maybe it's on some place that has a beach and then it has a coconut tree or something.
Yes,
So I was kind of.
so the intent was that this was an oasis in the middle of a massive desert, far away from the ocean. So it wasn't intended to be a beach. Now, you may have caught me in a little botanical faux pas, because I don't know, now that you've mentioned it, whether coconut trees grow in the desert. So I may have to write an errata or an addendum to the next version of the book to apologize for that, because, or maybe I'll just go look and see. I did not think about it. See, I thought a lot about the insects, not as much about the plants.
That's what I was, and then also when they the part where the dragonflies or whatever fly, then they see like the trees. Those look like redwood trees or something. So I was confused to where the setting was, because they look kind of like redwood trees, or were those just like shrubberies or something?
So are we talking about? So which part are we talking about? Are we talking about the time when near the end of the book when they sort of shot into the sky on Mossy's back?
No, I think it's. I don't remember actually. Oh, wait, let me look. It's the part.
With the dinosaur?
Oh, the dinosaur.
That's my guess.
Right. They are not. They look.
The one. Going that page.
Before chapter
That because
before
those.
chapter 7.
Yeah, right before chapter 7.
Right.
Those
No,
things. They look
that scene right there is a silhouette of trees from a local park called Greenwood Furnace here in Pennsylvania. So those are not redwoods. Those are pine trees, local pine trees, and local deciduous trees that we have here. And we asked, oh no, it's not pine. What am I thinking? That is actually at, oh God, it's a small park in Phillipsburg where we camp. But that was from our cabin. I was looking out and I was sketching the silhouettes of the trees. Although, you know what? Now that you say it, those aren't giant redwoods, but we were at Muir Woods when we were out there. That redwoods would be a great story, because there's an entire ecology up there. I don't know, maybe you know this or not, but like on individual branches, there are specific species of salamanders and insects that grow up there, and there are branches high in the trees that actually have their own dirt because they're so big. They have their own dirt and own small plants growing. So that would actually be, okay, well, I'm going to write this down, CJ. If I end up doing a redwood story, I got to acknowledge CJ, give him a big thank you.
So when I read that scene, I'm like, what are conifer trees doing out in the middle of the desert, or on a tropical island, or wherever this is set? Because
Right. So the idea was that Rafe's rockets there early on, when Professor Owen activates them, sends the entire group way far away from the desert. And the notion there is that they got stuck in one of those high altitude currents that they essentially rode home. So you remember they go up at the end, they just want to get up in that high current and then zoom, zip away hundreds of miles. And so that's essentially what I was thinking, that they rode those currents to someplace very, very far away from the desert, essentially into our world.
That's actually very interesting.
Oh, okay, good.
I like that scene.
Good question.
Oh, yeah, I do actually. What inspired you to make the villains so cruel to the other characters, like other than your other stories where there might not have been a villain at all?
So part of that inspiration was really based upon some conversations I've gotten into with other academics, so other professors, and with people who live in the community around here. And it was, a couple of the conversations have been really surprising to me, sort of almost frightening to me, because they were essentially advocating that I not say certain things. So in other words, that I shouldn't talk about evolution, not just in class, but ever, that certain ideas were dangerous, that the notion that thinking for yourself was essentially a bad thing. And, you know, probably if you'd asked me before I'd started writing this book, I would have said, no, there aren't really people out there that want to make you stop thinking specific thoughts. I mean, I grew up in a small town, and I probably have sort of a Pollyanna view of the world sometimes, where everybody's nice and everybody lets everybody do what they want to do. And I think that the thing that surprised me as I was growing up was that I encountered more and more people who said, no, that's a bad idea, or that's something you shouldn't think. And so, you know, I've always sort of had this in the back of my head as to why people would do this. And as I was working on Last of the Sandwalkers, which was about Darwin, and that's when I sort of discovered Richard Owen. And Owen did so many of the same things. He was not entirely honest sometimes when he tried to stifle certain ideas. And as someone really who spends his life thinking and talking about thinking, you know, it's kind of a scary idea to think about someone saying you can't think certain thoughts, that you can't have certain opinions, especially when they're grounded scientifically in fact, right, or at least in evidence. And so that's where Owen came from. He was partly Richard Owen. He was also partly these people who I have encountered. And you know what I try to do, and one of the things I was a little nervous about with Owen, and I think we talked a little about this before, was that there is a certain hand-wringing nastiness to him. They're actually, so what I tried to do was take situations that I've heard about on the news or books that I've read in which certain people express certain ideas. So there's that scene he's underground with Miriam. Remember Miriam's the beetle that was drilling, that he pushed off the ledge? Does that sound familiar?
Okay,
well, in that particular situation, he's telling her that he must be right because Scarabus hasn't struck him down, right? That everything he's doing is probably okay because he hasn't been killed, essentially, by Scarabus. And I actually had that specific conversation with somebody who told me that they were doing something that I considered naughty, and they said, no, 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 because I haven't been punished, it's okay. And so, so I was sort of really drawing on some of my personal experiences when I wrote him. And when I had that conversation with the person, this same person told me that President Obama was an alien. And he had told, so yeah, and so he wasn't getting his flu vaccines for his kids at all. It was all this kind of stuff that I just could not wrap my head around. And then he sort of launched into that because he hadn't been punished, that he must be right. And I thought, wow, that's a scary perspective. So that's where Owen came from. He's sort of a Frankenstein monster from several different experiences that I've stitched together.
Very good. Shadow King asked another question from the internet, and he was asking about why do you choose? No, but it was a differently phrased question.
It's what bugs did you?
Right.
How did you choose the bugs?
Yeah. Why do you choose each type of bug? What is it? Are you trying to get through sort of the entire bug kingdom one at a time? Are you, or is it just what you're particularly fascinated by at the moment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, with the first book about honeybees, my research as a graduate student and as a postdoc was with honeybees. So I studied how their muscles and nerves worked as an undergraduate, and specifically what I was interested in my research was what happens to their muscles and nerves when they get so cold that they pass out. So at the very beginning of the Sandwalk Adventures, when they come out of chill coma, do you remember that?
Yeah.
Chill coma is what I studied as a graduate student. And anyway, so for the bees, I became fascinated in bees because those were the animals I was studying. And as I was studying them, I kept thinking what a great story their lives would make. And it wasn't until a guy named Gib Bickle, who worked at the Laughing Ogre in Columbus, Ohio, said, hey, you should write that story. That I actually, a little light bulb went off in my head, and I did. Since I study insects, that's really where my interests in biology lie. The second book, the Sandwalk Adventures with Darwin, that was because I wanted to tell a Darwin story. And the truth is, in that particular case, I started just sort of a straightforward Darwin biography. I have a good friend, Jim Ottaviani, who's written Feynman, and he's written a whole bunch of other books that are biographies of scientists. And as I was writing this biography of Darwin, I realized very quickly that I was no Jim Ottaviani. And that Darwin had so many biographies written about him that I wasn't really adding anything new. And it was while I was struggling with that I read an article called Body Beasts in National Geographic, and it talked about these follicle mites, and we all have them, right? So 90% of people living in North America have little mites sitting in their eyebrows and the hairline right now, sucking juice out of our cells. And yeah, exactly. And it doesn't matter what you do, you can't scrub them out. They're pretty harmless. And it was as I was reading that article that one synapse must have fired in my brain and said, wow, what would a mite living in Darwin's eyebrow think of Darwin? And it was that moment that the whole thing unfolded. I thought, wow, they would think he was their planet or he was their god or whatever. And I'm like, oh, okay, so the minute that happened, right, there was a whole cascade of things. I could tell stories about Darwin's life, but he could tell stories about his own theory. And so in that case, the insect, or the arachnid in that case, sort of was my entry point into Darwin's life, which was my main thing I was interested in. When it came to beetles, beetles to me are amazing. Beetles are the Justice League of the Justice League and the Avengers and the X-Men of the animal world, because there are more species of beetles than birds, mammals, reptiles, fish, amphibians, all put together.
Yeah.
Right? So this is an enormously successful group of individuals, and I was wondering, what made them so successful? The original title to this book, Last of the Sandwalkers, was called The Age of Elytra. And elytra are those hard wing covers that are on the back of a beetle. So if you've ever seen a ladybug open up her spotted back, those hard coverings that she's opening, those are her elytra. And that's probably one of the ability to have those hard wing covers and hide in little nooks and crannies probably contributed a lot to their success. And because they've been so successful, they've evolved the ability to spray hot fire or be the same shape as a leaf, have huge horns, right? Collect water on their backs. And so for me, the beetles in this case offered this opportunity to sort of kind of tell a little bit of a superhero story. So I don't know that I've ever written this down or admitted this in public, not met it, but this is sort of my Fantastic Four. There's a little Fantastic Four going on here. So, Lucy, the smart scientist who collects water, which is fluid, that's Mr. Fantastic. Mossy is the Thing. Rafe is the lightning bug, right? He's essentially the Human Torch. And Professor Bombardier, she sprays invisible gas. I mean, that is our Invisible Woman. And so that was, along with Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, those were my favorite characters growing up. And so this was my chance to tell a story about explorers that sort of kind of had those powers. So a lot of the times the insects are things I'm interested in, but they make it possible for me to tell the stories I want to tell. Does that make sense? It's sort of two components there. I want to talk about insects, but they offer me the opportunity to tell other stories as well. What's up, CJ?
Oh my god, my voice sounds weird.
That's okay. We all read comics. We're all just a little weird.
Yeah,
Okay?
yeah.
So it's good.
Most definitely. But I was just wondering, since you said the original title was Age of Elytra, is that why you chose that for Lucy to say that in the book? I mean, it's kind of obvious.
I did. And that was originally going to be the explanation for the title. It occurs to me that I never actually answered the question. Well, I sort of answered the question about her being called a sandwalker. I kind of got there. I said that she was a fog collector. In the book, when I was writing it, I thought it would be just kind of a cute little joke for Owen to call her species sandwalkers. It would be a way of me winking my eye at the reader so that they would say, if you've read Last of the Sandwalkers, you sort of get the joke. My editor at First Second read through it and said, this is what we have to call the book. We have to call it The Sandwalker. And I said, oh my goodness, no. that's too confusing. And so we went through a couple iterations before we figured that out. Okay, so I've sort of completed that question now. Thanks for the reminder.
Yeah. We had a question in the back?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Is the guy is the real who tells stories with a stick? How do you pronounce his name? The dog?
What's that?
Or do you pronounce the guy who tells stories with a stick? Do you pronounce him like Dog or something else?
I can't really hear this one.
So he's saying the actually why don't you scoot on up a little closer so we can.
Yeah.
There you
So the guy who tells stories on a stick. The
Oh, yep.
Yeah. How do you pronounce his name?
Mad Dog.
Mad.
Mad Dog. And did I write in the annotations where that name came from?
No.
Okay, so it's short for Mad Dog. Okay? When I was an undergraduate student, my very first semester, I took Bio 1 with a teacher named Michael D. Johnson. M.D. Johnson, and the M.D. stood for Mad Dog. And he was a mad dog because he could have been the grouchiest person I ever met in my life. He was from Chicago. He was impatient. He would do things. He was sarcastic in class. He was impatient with goofy people who came to class half drunk. He'd kick them out. And he became probably one of my best friends. When I graduated. He was my advisor, and he was my good friend. And he passed away, unfortunately, a little bit after I graduated. But he was an incredible storyteller in front of the class. And he was the first person where I got the idea that, you know, teaching a science class can be done in one and two ways. And I think this is true for telling science comics. You can make them just fancy, well-illustrated textbooks, which I think is boring. Or you can tell a story. You can have a narrative, right? Mad Dog, he would come in to class, and our topic of the day would be, I'm not sure, he'd come in with reproduction. We're going to talk about reproduction biologically. But he'd tell these stories about what animals do to meet a member of the opposite, you know, sex, how they would court. I mean, it was a story. And those stories have stuck with me for, gosh, what, that was 1985, so a gajillion years since that happened. And he really shaped the way I teach. I try to teach my lectures as stories. And so I don't like to teach lists of things, memorize these things, blah, 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 blah. Because without a story, without a narrative, there's no context. And there's no reason to care, right? And so I think, you know, I could have written a book where I explained all the important things about honeybees. But I think writing a book where we have one main character and we follow her around and we follow her from her life to her death. You know, I've had kids come up to me who read Clan Apis and said, "Oh, we cried at the end." And I always think to myself, "Ah, it's perfect. You cried because of a cartoon bee dying." Now, this is an animal that many people would probably just stomp on if they got the chance, right? So if I can make you feel about a bee with a story, then that's what I want to do. And so Mad Dog was very much Michael D. Johnson. He was the first science storyteller that I ever really experienced, and he had a tremendous influence on me.
I guess the last thing I want to do, because we're getting pretty close to the end of our hours, I just wanted to ask you guys what you guys, you know, what was like your favorite scene in the book? What did you look through? Okay. Shoot, go ahead. Doc, go ahead.
Oh, me? Okay.
Yeah.
I really like that scene with Twinkle.
Yeah, I love Twinkle. She doesn't, I mean, there's another thing. You know, it's very easy to make Twinkle a villain, but in real life, those beetles, they're just trying to get some poison to keep their babies safe. So she's pretty ridiculous, but, you know, also not unsympathetic. And I think she's funny, too. I mean, I probably shouldn't say, "Oh, I wrote that, and I think that's so funny." But she did. I was writing some lines for Twinkle, and I remember laughing out loud when I did.
How about you, CJ?
Probably when they find the human, because that was a really good scene, and I love reading it because I wrote it in a very weird way.
Right. Yeah, it took me a long time to do. I've drawn lots of bugs, but not many skeletons. So I went down to our lab and I grabbed the plastic skeleton hanging in the anatomy lab and laid it out on my table, just so I could try to draw it correctly. And I had students coming in thinking I was even weirder than they thought I was.
Well, you did a good job. I must say that.
Okay. Well, thank you, CJ.
And how about you? What was your favorite scene?
My favorite scene was when Owen blew up the cave.
Oh yeah.
Before chapter 10.
Cool. Cool.
Which one was that? Owen did what?
When he blew up a cave before chapter 10.
Yeah. You know what? You know what my favorite thing to draw in that was? It's I think it's a 9-panel page where he's sort of sneaking out with his flashlight.
Yeah.
And that page, I sort of figured some things out artistically. How do I make the rocks look like they're in shadow, but that they're still in the light of a flashlight? And what's really was exciting about that page is that even after doing this for like 20 years, I still am figuring out new things to do, and it was exciting. So that particular sequence is one of my favorites as well.
I think my favorite bit was when Rafe has the laser beams come from his eyes.
Oh, that's
I hit that point of the book, and I just screamed out loud. I thought that was so funny.
Oh yeah, I love that. And then he tries to do it again, and he takes a picture.
Yeah. That was awesome. That was awesome. Well, I think we all really enjoy. Oh, we have an adult comment too.
Oh,
yes.
yeah, this is just a humble suggestion based on your own earlier comment. I think it'd be wonderful to make a mosquito version of Les Mis, especially when you said, what are they doing except stealing blood for their children, right? So it'd be a great crossover. I can see it as a musical, but it'd be safer than Spider-Man.
Le Mosquito.
Yeah,
Oh, let me skip on.
so I give it back to you. Right?
Okay, you know what? You got to give me your name, because if I ever do that.
Lisa. Lisa, I spell it L-E-A-S-E -A-G-H. So,
Okay, now I know. If you ever see that in the store, I know.
the audience expansion would be amazing.
That's right. I agree. Hey, I'm always looking for the next good hook.
Oh, I would love that.
You came out of this with two new ideas.
I know, you guys are incredible. You got to do this again next week.
Right.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you for your time, Jay. We love the book, and yeah, it's great stuff. So keep doing it, man.
I'm going to thank Brian, because I want you guys to know that he's got to get some don't fall over, first of all. Brian supported my books when they were just little bitty floppy comics coming out in the late 90s. And I can remember before, anybody was really paying attention, Brian was. And so I've never met Brian, but he has always been top of my list, because he is a great supporter of people who are trying to do something different, and I am deeply, deeply appreciative and very excited to have been here.
Well, thank you. The reason I support people who are doing stuff that's different is because you're putting yourself out there, and you're putting your creativity out there, and I think that's a wonderful thing. So I'm happy to support that. So
excellent, simpatico. Well, thank you again. You have been a great audience.
Thanks very much.
All right.
All right. Take care.